Hi everybody, Brian Matthey from Verico the Mortgage Professionals in Kingston, and welcome to another edition of Mortgage Straight Talk. Today in Mortgage Straight Talk I'm going to talk about the truth about amortization. In my last video, which was on 5 versus 10-year fixed terms, I quoted some amortization examples, and for anybody watching that, without an explanation of amortization, you may have looked at them and said, you know what, one plan actually left me longer time to pay my mortgage. And that's not really the case. So what I'm going to do today is try and give you an overview of what amortization is all about and how it can impact your mortgage. So first of all, what is it? Amortization is the length of time over which your payments are based. And today, the maximum amount of amortization is 30 years. I can say back in the day, because I've been around for a little while, we used to have 40-year amortizations and we used to have 35-year amortizations. Those were closed off by the government, and now we're cut back to 30 years for an amortization. But if the truth be known, those amortizations really only helped people get qualified for a mortgage because of their payment being lower, which allowed for a lower income to get into a mortgage. But nobody ever plans to be in a mortgage and pays the mortgage over 30 years. Certainly not if you're planning right with your mortgage. So, anytime I'm looking at a first-time buyer or an existing homeowner, we're going to look at a maximum of 30-year amortization, and we're going to look at a bi-weekly payment, because bi-weekly payment or weekly payment is going to help you accelerate the rate at which you pay your mortgage down. And currently, if you've got a 30-year amortization, bi-weekly works out to about 26.3 years, and weekly works out to about the same. Now, amortization is relative only to the term of your mortgage, the interest rate, and the payment that you have at any particular time. So when somebody sits down and you says you have so many years left on your mortgage, that amortization has to be analyzed every time your term ends on your mortgage, because it will be impacted by the current rate that you have, the payments that you have, and whether the rate's going up or down, or in fact, whether in fact you've increased your payment since renewal date. So, in my 5 and 10, I actually showed you examples where the amortization appeared to be higher. So here's what you've got to remember when you're going into amortization. Amortization is a plan. So when you start at the end of each term, if it's a 5-year term or a 3-year term or whatever term you choose, you have to review it, because it's only good for your term. And if you want to get a better idea of what your actual amortization could be in a mortgage, the way to do it is to imply an average rate over the term. So if you're in less than 3% right now and you suspect that maybe rates may go up, but your average over the term might be 4 or 4.5%, you can take that and plug that into a mortgage calculator, calculate it out as an average, and it'll give you a more realistic idea of what payment would be required at that interest rate to reduce your mortgage within the time that you're looking at. And there's two things about amortization. There's one called actual amortization and one that's contracted. Contracted amortization is when you start with a 30-year amortization. You've been 5 years into a mortgage, and you actually have a contracted amortization of 25 years remaining. That may not be your actual amortization, because depending on what you've done with your mortgage, if you've gone bi-weekly, if you've increased your payments, your remaining amortization may be much less. But also, as I explained in my video on 5 versus 10, if you start with a 30 and something happens and you want to go back and you've accelerated your payments and reduced your term, 30-year gives you the flexibility to go back to what your contracted amortization is. So if you're 5 years into a term but you only have 16 years left, and for some reason you need to amend that payment, you can actually go back to 25 years. When you've got a variable mortgage, it's a little different, and it's more difficult to calculate because, again, depending on how you're handling that variable rate mortgage, whether you're putting higher payments than what is required by the lower rate, or if you're making the lowest payment at the time, again, your amortization is going to be affected on how you're actually treating that variable. So, those are some of the tips that I can think of relative to amortization. Again, it's only an illustration. You have to take a look at that amortization every time you do a renewal on your mortgage, because it should be part of your plan as to how you're going to reduce your mortgage from a start of 30 years to where you want to get it. Now, how can you impact your amortization? Obviously by prepayment with lump sums or a payment increase. And in my next video, I'm going to tell you about the rule of 5. And the rule of 5 is a very, very, very simple way that you can put a plan in place that potentially, as an illustration, can reduce your mortgage from 30 years to almost in half. That's it for today's edition of Mortgage Straight Talk. I'm Brian Matthey from The Mortgage Professionals. I seem to have a hard time saying Brian Matthey sometimes. But I am Brian Matthey from The Mortgage Professionals in Kingston, Ontario. This is Mortgage Straight Talk, and thanks for watching.